September 14th, 2008, 6 p.m. Inside a secure conference room in New York, the most powerful bankers in America realized they had less than 24 hours to save the global economy. They failed. What happened in those final hours didn't just crash the stock market, it erased $13 trillion in wealth. It destroyed 8 million jobs, and it triggered the worst economic disaster since the Great Depression. But here's what most people don't know. The entire crisis could have been stopped that weekend. The men in that room had the power, the money, and the knowledge to prevent the collapse. So why didn't they? To understand that night, you need to understand what led to it. For years, banks had been handing out home loans like candy. No income? No problem. No job? Approved. They called them subprime mortgages, loans given to people who couldn't really afford them. But banks didn't care because they weren't keeping the risk. They bundled thousands of these risky mortgages together and sold them as investments to pension funds, insurance companies, and banks around the world. Wall Street gave these bundles fancy names: mortgage-backed securities, collateralized debt obligations, credit default swaps. The system was brilliant and completely reckless. Everyone made money until the music stopped. In 2007, homeowners started defaulting, first a few, then thousands, then millions. The investments built on those loans began to collapse, and suddenly nobody knew what anything was worth. Banks that owned these toxic assets started hemorrhaging cash. Bear Stearns collapsed in March 2008. The government bailed them out, but the bleeding didn't stop. By September, one name was on everyone's lips: Lehman Brothers. Lehman Brothers wasn't just another bank. It was 158 years old, a Wall Street giant, the fourth largest investment bank in America. But behind the marble lobby and the confident press releases, Lehman was drowning. They had over $600 billion in assets, most of it tied to real estate that was now worthless. Their stock price was in free fall. Clients were pulling their money. Trading partners refused to do business with them. Lehman was dying, and everyone on Wall Street knew it. Here's the part that should terrify you. Lehman wasn't unique. Nearly every major bank had the same problem. They had all made the same bets, bought the same toxic assets, used the same tricks to hide their losses. Lehman was just the first domino. If it fell, the entire system could collapse. That's why on September 13, 2008, Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson called an emergency meeting at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. He summoned the CEOs of every major Wall Street firm: Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, J.P. Morgan Chase, Citigroup, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch. The message was clear: find a solution or face total collapse. But there was a catch. Paulson, a former Goldman Sachs CEO himself, made one thing clear: the government would not bail out Lehman. The banks had to save themselves. So what happened inside that room? The bankers had two options: find a buyer for Lehman or let it die and hope the system survived. Two potential buyers emerged: Bank of America and Barclays, a British bank. All day Saturday, negotiations continued. Bankers worked the phones, lawyers drafted agreements, government officials shuttled between rooms. Ben Bernanke, chairman of the Federal Reserve, warned, "We may not have an economy on Monday." But by Sunday morning, both deals were falling apart. Bank of America got spooked. They decided to buy Merrill Lynch instead, another investment bank on the edge of collapse. Barclays wanted to buy Lehman, but British regulators refused to approve the deal without a government guarantee. Paulson said no. That's when the mood shifted. Panic set in. One by one, bankers stood up and delivered the same message: if Lehman goes down, we're all at risk. The financial system was interconnected like never before. Lehman owed money to thousands of companies. It had trillions in derivative contracts. Its collapse would trigger a chain reaction. Credit would freeze, lending would stop, companies couldn't make payroll. The economy would seize up like an engine without oil. Ben Bernanke and Paulson knew this, but they believed letting Lehman fail would send a message. Reckless banks would not be rescued. It was a gamble, a massive, historic gamble. And they lost. At 1:45 a.m. on Monday, September 15, 2008, Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy. 158 years of history, gone. 25,000 employees, jobless. But that was just the beginning. When markets opened Monday morning, chaos erupted. The Dow Jones dropped 504 points in a single day. Credit markets, the invisible system that keeps money flowing through the economy, completely froze. Banks stopped lending to each other. They didn't know who next was to fail. Within days, Washington Mutual collapsed. Wachovia nearly failed. AIG, the largest insurance company in the world, had to be rescued with $85 billion in taxpayer money. The panic spread globally. Stock markets in London, Tokyo, Frankfurt, all crashing. Iceland's entire banking system collapsed. Governments across Europe scrambled to prevent bank runs. Back in the United States, ordinary people watched their retirement accounts vanish. Small businesses couldn't get loans to make payroll. Families lost their homes, their jobs, their savings. Construction workers, teachers, factory employees, people who had nothing to do with Wall Street paid the price for decisions made in that conference room. By the time the dust settled, the unemployment rate hit 10%. 8 million Americans lost their jobs. Millions more lost their homes. An entire generation saw their wealth disappear overnight. Here's what really happened that weekend. The people in power made a choice. They decided that saving Lehman would create moral hazard. It would teach banks they could take reckless risks and always get bailed out. So they let it fail, believing the system could absorb the shock. They were catastrophically wrong. Within weeks, the same government that refused to save Lehman spent $700 billion bailing out the rest of Wall Street. Taxpayers, people who had no say in the reckless bets that caused the crisis, were forced to rescue the banks that created the mess. And almost none of the executives responsible went to jail. No major reform prevented it from happening again. The big banks, they got bigger. Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, they emerged more powerful than before. Meanwhile, millions of ordinary Americans spent years rebuilding their lives. The 2008 crisis proved something disturbing. The financial system had become too big, too complex, and too interconnected for anyone to truly control. The men in that room weren't evil, but they were overconfident. They believed they understood the risks, that they could manage the fallout. They were managing a system that had grown beyond human comprehension, a web of derivatives, leveraged bets, and hidden risks that even the smartest minds on Wall Street didn't fully understand. Those 24 hours changed everything. They exposed the fragility of modern capitalism. They revealed how decisions made in closed-door meetings can destroy the lives of millions. And they proved that when the system breaks, it's not the people who broke it that suffer most, it's everyone else. Today, the global financial system is larger and more complex than it was in 2008. The same banks hold even more power. The same risks, repackaged and renamed, still exist. So the real question isn't whether another crisis will happen, it's whether we'll be ready when those 24 hours come again. Because next time, we might not be so lucky.